episode of the Coffee with Philosophers podcast, I'm honored to have on Dr. Daniel Rubio to discuss his paper, Intrinsically Good, God Created Them, which is forthcoming in the Oxford Studies in Philosophy of Religion collected volume. His paper is a response to arguments by Eric Wielenberg and Mark Murphy. Now, they argue that creatures are not intrinsically good. So you and I, we're not intrinsically good. Murphy agrees with Wielenberg, believe it or not. Theist is agreeing here with an atheist that theists should think creaturely intrinsic value doesn't exist. Yet Murphy disagrees with Wielenberg in thinking this is a problem. He thinks this is something a theist should embrace. Now, enter Daniel Rubio. He argues against the conclusion that there's no creaturely intrinsic value, so he's trying to give us back our intrinsic value status. In a recent interview with Jonathan Rutledge, which I did, which I'll provide a link to in the description notes, he and his co-author, Jordan Wessling, cited affirmatively this paper by Rubio. They said, quote, "We think there is cause to maintain that creatures are intrinsically valuable." Daniel Rubio, forthcoming, has argued the case against Murphy in detail and plausibly to our minds. Here we have nothing to add to the case, but we invite interested readers to consult this essay. So that's what we're doing today. We're consulting this essay, and we're going to look at Daniel Rubio's important contribution to this discussion. Dr. Rubio is assistant professor of philosophy at Toronto Metropolitan University. He specializes in basically all major areas of philosophy: metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, logic, and even specializes in decision theory and, of course, philosophy of religion. He has a ton of publications that you can check out on his Phil People page. Phil People page, that's kind of hard to say. And then I'll provide a link to that as well. Thank you, Dr. Rubio, for coming on the Coffee with Philosophers podcast.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
So the question I'd like to ask is the 5 books question. What 5 single-volume books would you bring to a deserted island, other than the Bible, if you knew you were going to be stuck there alone for 10 years?
Okay, good. So we're setting aside the Bible. So one question I have about the question is do I already know how to survive on the island? Because if not, number 1 is going to be a field guide to the island and its surrounding waters. That way I know what I can eat, what I can use as medicine, what I should stay away from.
We'll say you don't know how to survive. You just plunk down. So it's up to you how you want to fill that out.
Well, I definitely want the field guide then. Because I don't know very much about desert ecosystems and waters around them. So that would be number 1. Got to stay alive for those 10 years. But of course, you also have to have something to do. So second, there's going to be some books that I would characterize as kind of more work-like philosophy books. 10 years is a long time, so you probably want to learn something or reinforce some old skill. At which point, the Chang and Kiesler textbook on model theory would probably be a fitting one for me. And maybe also a good book on measure theory. Since, one thing to do for those 10 years is to learn new stuff and practice proof skills and things like that. So that would be one kind of wing of books after the field guide. But then, of course, you also have to have something interesting. And so the other books would probably be more fiction books. In particular, I think one of them would be The Silmarillion. That's a pretty big book. There's a lot going on there. And it's kind of broad and sketchy, which gives you lots of room for kind of imagining and thinking through details. Another thing to do with those 10 years of isolation. And then maybe another novel. Maybe Moby Dick. It's got a ton on whaling in it. The book is half novel, half treatise on whaling. The novel itself is interesting, but the whaling information might also be good if you're stuck on an island.
Nice. That's a great collection. And then what is the modeling piece? Is that a logic text or? Yeah,
basically. Model theory is one branch of logic, and it's one that I've studied a little bit. I did a course on it in grad school. I occasionally use it in my work. But something that I could be better at, and that's the classic graduate textbook.
Okay. All right. Great. Well, thank you so much for those. And I'd like to just kind of get on the table. Why does your conclusion basically that Murphy and Wielenberg haven't succeeded. We haven't been given adequate reason to think that creatures have no intrinsic value. Why does this matter whether we have intrinsic value or created beings have intrinsic value? What sort of things do you hang on this, whether it's true or false?
So one way of thinking of a thing's intrinsic value as the sort of value that it has because of the kind of thing that it is, or because that it's you couldn't have that thing without having that level of value. So the contrast here is to extrinsic value, which is the value it's going to have in terms of its extrinsic properties. And as we'll see kind of later in the conversation, the intrinsic extrinsic distinction is quite vexed. There are a lot of attempts to analyze it. Maybe none of them quite succeed. Maybe some do better, some do worse. But the theoretical job of an intrinsic property is to be the properties that characterize the way a thing is itself. So if you go back to G.E. Moore, who's the one who sort of reintroduced the term intrinsic value into contemporary philosophy, that's the gloss he gives. And then if you look at how the conversation, it kind of splits after Moore. So you've got one wing that kind of runs through Chisholm and Kim and Lewis, that really kind of gloms onto the intrinsic thing and tries to get a handle on what that notion is. And then you have a different wing of the conversation that goes sort of through Korsgaard, Noah Lemos, Michael Zimmerman, Mark Murphy. There's a lot of people in that hook onto intrinsic value as a kind of value or a theoretical role that value sometimes plays. But what unifies the two is this idea that the intrinsic value is supposed to be the baseline value the thing has. The thing has because of the kind of thing that it is, as opposed to other sorts of value that you might get from your place, maybe the kind of value you might get because of a position that you instantiate or a role that you play in society. Those sorts of things aren't intrinsic values. They depend on these sort of networks of extrinsic properties and relations. And that's the sort of thing that comes and goes. You could be, the world could be completely different and you keep your intrinsic value. It could be completely different and your extrinsic values could change.
And then kind of going back to what you were saying about the two sort of divisions or tracks of pursuing this inquiry into intrinsic value, Korsgaard has an important paper, her 1983 paper. I think it's Two Distinctions in Goodness, or
yes, yep,
something like that. Well, and so I just want to clarify these terms. Are we thinking of it in a Korsgaardian sense in terms of intrinsic value is about where the value is located and it's located in the being, as opposed to extrinsic value, which, as you mentioned, is located in relations or ad extra to the being. And then you contrast that with final value and instrumental value, which is kind of often confused or conflated, according to her. That is, oftentimes people contrast intrinsic value with instrumental value. That is, value in terms of something being a means to an end. And then they think of intrinsic value as the thing that it has in itself, not apart from whether it's a means to a valuable end. So I'm just asking for clarification, because are we thinking of it in this more strict Korsgaardian sense where you have intrinsic, extrinsic, final value, which she calls, just having value in and of itself and not as a means to something else, and then instrumental value. So how are we thinking of these distinctions in your paper as kind of the background?
Yeah, so I'm fully on board with this Korsgaardian picture. I think she's right that the value something has intrinsically could still be instrumental. And you can sort of think of, so a classic example of an intrinsic property is a shape. Something might have an instrumental value because of its shape. Say it's you're trying to get something off of from far away and it's hook-shaped. Its shape, which is intrinsic to it, will have instrumental value in that situation. But in a different situation, it won't have that instrumental value. It'll still have the thing that confers the value, the shape. It'll still have that. And so that is one sort of case. Or you could have extrinsic final value. So the final instrumental distinction is sort of about why the thing is valuable Is it not explained at all? Or is it explained in terms of some sort of further goal or some sort of other type of value that you get out of it? So an organic unity might be like this. So you say you think like a beautiful painting has final value. That value is going to be partly extrinsic because it will depend on the sort of particular relations either between. So like think of the top half of the painting might only have value extrinsically because of its relation to the bottom half of the painting. Say like, by itself it's really ugly, but you put them together and you get this cool contrast. That value is not necessarily going to be instrumental. Like it'll have some instrumental value too, like say its price. But if you think that like beautiful things are valuable for no other purpose than the fact that they're beautiful, that'll be final value. So I think sort of with course guard that you can tease these things apart, even though when we're speaking loosely, and I think it's partly because of this phrase of itself or in itself that sort of very naturally attaches to both intrinsic as a way of characterizing a property, but also to final value as a way of characterizing or contrasting with for the sake of something else. But I think Korsgaard was right to tease those apart. And interestingly, she spends a significant chunk of that paper going back and, well, not back and forth, but debating whether the way she's thinking of intrinsic value is better than the way that someone like G.E. Moore is thinking of it.
And then we're going to, that's helpful. So just to kind of summarize, that was a helpful explanation of the way that the two distinctions in goodness can kind of cross pollinate, so to speak. So you need to keep them separate. Also, one way of thinking of it is in terms of intrinsic and extrinsic is the location of the value. I think she says this. And then extrinsic versus instrumental, on the other hand, is in terms of how it's valued. That is it valued as an end in itself, or is it valued as a means to a further end? So I just want to clarify that because this will become important in your paper if I'm tracking correctly, because if we're talking about the location, you're trying to capture intrinsic value, then we need to sort of isolate it from other relations. Because as you mentioned, extrinsic value is in terms of relations, right?
That's at least one sort of rough, ready way to capture it. So I wouldn't say, I wouldn't identify them, but as like a first gloss or a close for government work, that works.
Okay. Yeah. It's just a rough sketch because it's going to become important. As you mentioned, like you develop a proof by construction in section 2. So you start out with like a direct argument for created intrinsic value, which I like. You just sort of are like, here it is. And so you do discuss more, and you discuss Kim, Chisholm, and then you sort of land on Lewis and Langdon. And you talk about how their notion of something being independent of accompaniment. Can you explain this, and then like how their independence principle sort of captures that idea of independence of accompaniment?
Yeah, so the way this history goes, you had Chisholm talking about an internal property, and he's getting that language a bit from Moore, and he's trying to talk about the thing that ends up becoming intrinsicality. And so then Kim picks up on that from Chisholm, and Kim is also interested in characterizing an intrinsic property. And he ends up saying, well, an intrinsic property is a property that a thing has when it's all alone. And that's the thought there, is that, like, look, extrinsic is kind of sort of very relational, or at least the presence of other things is super relevant to what extrinsic properties a thing has. So just like delete all the other things, and now we've got the thing with only its intrinsic properties because there's nothing to stand in relation to. And then less than a year later, Lewis comes along and goes, that's not quite right. So you've got this Kim paper and then a Lewis paper like immediately after. And the Lewis paper is quite short. And it basically says, Kim proposes this definition. There's a decent amount going for it. But consider the property of being alone. The property of being alone is not intrinsic. Even though it's not relational, it sort of makes reference to more than the thing itself. It makes reference to how the rest of the universe is, namely empty. And so that was that. And then Lewis ends up kind of going through multiple iterations of trying to define an intrinsic property you can sort of find in his corpus. Eventually teams up with Ray Langton in this Langton and Lewis paper, where they come up with the idea of independent of accompaniment. And so standardly in independence test, you sort of look at multiple different cases. If two things are independent, say they exist independent of each other, then either of them can exist without the other one. So the independent of accompaniment thought is a thing is intrinsic if the object can have it when there's other stuff, but also when there's no other stuff. And that's going to take aloneness out of the picture, because you can be alone when there's no other stuff, but you can't be alone when there's other stuff. So it doesn't pass the independent of accompaniment test. And that sort of led into the Langton and Lewis definition. And they talk about this other thing, naturalness, that ends up being important, that I sort of skipped over because I knew that I wasn't going to use it that much in my final definition. So I didn't want to go through effectively what happens in that section of the paper is a philosophical technique known as chisming, where you state a definition
I love that.
and you give a counterexample, and then you refine the definition, then you give another counterexample, and you refine it again. So it's named after Roderick Chisholm because he was sort of famous or infamous, depending on whether you think it's a good technique or a bad technique, for doing this in his papers. And it's like sort of the philosophical equivalent of showing your work. So especially when you get a really complicated concept that's you think like that the right way to define it or to characterize it is going to be one of these, 5 clause monstrosities, which is what I end up with. It's really hard, especially on your reader, if you just throw the final definition at them at the start. Because it's immediately there's what's this clause doing? What's that clause doing? Why is it so complicated? So you start out with a simple thing that's somewhat close to people's intuitions. And then you sort of guide them through the various string of counterexamples that sort of might mirror the process that you went through when you were working out the paper yourself. And that way, people are sort of with you for the whole journey, so they understand which decisions you've made about what to include or what to exclude, and what sort of things you're worried about when you're formulating your final definition. So I did that actually not initially in this paper. I did this in another paper on death, where I was trying to argue that death isn't harmful to the one who dies, and using the sort of Korsgaard grid as a way to really you can't find the harm of death in this quadrant, can't find it in this quadrant, can't find it in that quadrant. So there it became important too to have a good working definition of intrinsic versus extrinsic. And I started with Langton and Lewis because partly is just the affinity with David Lewis, but that's the jumping off point for a lot of the modern intrinsicality literature. The general consensus is that they were wrong, but that they were right enough that you can use them as your starting point.
Okay. And so kind of to get in, maybe we'll skip over a little the chisming, as you mentioned.
Yep.
And we won't chism you guys to death, although I love that. I came across that in grad school, and I was like, it was happening in all these papers, and finally somebody mentioned to me, oh, that paper's chisming, and I was like, what do you mean chisming? And then, you go through all these iterations, PR star, PR star star, PR, and anyway, you end up with instance independence 3. So you don't take them on a too bad of a chisming adventure, but you say some object having a property is independent of accompaniment, just in case. Now, can you tell us again, why is it important that it having the property is independent of accompaniment? Is that because this is that's how we're thinking of intrinsic value?
Yeah, the thought is that you can use the independence test to give a starting base thought about how to define intrinsicality. Now, one thing that I'll note here is we jump from the initial Langton and Lewis definition to the one I've given, is that we're now not just talking about properties being intrinsic, we're talking about property instances being intrinsic.
Okay, good.
And that's sort of an important kind of bringing the streams back together in the discussion of intrinsicality. So the modern discussion of intrinsicality starts with intrinsic value. It starts in G.E. Moore in the Principia Ethica. Then the metaphysicians kind of got to it first. And they were interested in the contrast between something like shape and something like distance from, where distance from will be extrinsic and shape's going to be intrinsic. And so at that level, like talking about properties as intrinsic or extrinsic makes sense. When you've got a property like value that's sort of so malleable and multiply realizable, you realize, oh, you could have this property in a bunch of different ways, some of which are going to be intrinsic and some of which are going to be extrinsic. That was one of the insights of Korstar's paper. At which point you need something a little more fine-grained than a definition of intrinsicality that applies to properties as a whole. You need to be able to say, okay, sometimes this property could be had in an intrinsic way, sometimes it could be had in an extrinsic way. Which, again, other people noticed this first. There's this Trogdon and Whitmer paper that I sort of use as a starting point for what I'm doing, but they're also in the Langton Lewis tradition.
Okay, so you're tying it to an instance so that we're just focusing on one particular point in time, the sort of properties that it has at that time, because as you say, at another time, it could be extrinsic as opposed to intrinsic.
Right,
So,
or not even another time, at the same time. You can have something that's got some of its value intrinsically, some of its value extrinsically. As you want to be able to tease that apart, you say, oh, this is valuable for multiple reasons. Like taking into a case, take a skilled carpenter. The skilled carpenter has got like intrinsic value because of something like the inherent dignity of being a human, but they also have extrinsic value because like they can make nice cabinets and they can contribute to the economy and they can support a family. Like those are all extrinsic ways of being valuable.
Okay, so you're right. So at a particular instance, a thing could have both intrinsic and extrinsic properties, but you're trying to isolate the intrinsicality at a particular time. Is that right?
I want to say, I want a little test to say, like, this is when a thing has got this value property intrinsically.
Okay. And you say, number one, the object has the property. It's got to have it.
Right.
Two, it can have that property while lonely, in isolation from anything else. Is that another way of saying that?
Exactly. Yeah. Yep. Think of it as three. It's the only thing that exists.
Only thing that exists. Three, it can have that property while accompanied. And accompanied means
some other stuff exists too.
Some other stuff in the universe.
Right, exactly. It doesn't really matter what the other stuff is. You could, in theory, be any other stuff that's impossible with it.
Okay. And then 4, something can lack that property while lonely. It can be by itself and not have it.
Right.
And then 5, something can lack that property while accompanied. So other stuff can be around and it cannot have it. Okay,
right.
And then
so
you say,
have the property or not have the property either alone or with other stuff.
Okay. Can have it or not have it alone or with other stuff. Okay. And now why do you think that sort of is a good, at least for now, a good landing spot regarding intrinsicality?
That's a good question.
And then just also to add to that, maybe this is because before we go into the argument for sovereign aseity, why in particular is this a good definition for the kind of intrinsicality we can have as creatures?
Yeah, so one thing that this does, it doesn't talk about relations at all, in part because like we as creatures aren't fundamental things, probably. We're constructed out of something, and then the something, people will fight over particles, fields, ideas. There's candidates out there. Forms and matter, kind of take your favorite metaphysics. Just about any high-level property we have, there's going to be some more fundamental explanation for why we have it. And because relative fundamentality or grounding or something like that is going to end up being a relation, if we sort of stick with the relational thought about extrinsicality, lots of our properties are going to wind up extrinsic, even the ones that are sort of paradigm cases of intrinsic properties. So I'll go back to shape again, because that's sort of the classic example. There are all sorts of metaphysical explanations for why I've got the shape that I have that are going to reference things like the Earth's gravitational field and the atmospheric pressure of the room I'm in and stuff like that. And if we go with like a purely relational concept of intrinsicality or extrinsicality, which kind of spoiler for when we get to that argument, Murphy does in his argument, then we just don't end up with intrinsic properties at all. So why this definition? There's sort of two answers to that. Number one, I started at a place that's fairly intuitive, the independence thought you can kind of find throughout the literature. And then why this form of the definition? Because this is the one that there weren't counterexamples to. Had I thought of more counterexamples, I would have chiseled it further. But once I hit instant independence 3, I was like, okay, I'm not thinking of any obvious things that it's doing badly.
Right.
So let's run with that as far as we can. Would I bet very much money on this being the final true characterization of intrinsicality? No, I would not.
Okay.
I'll bet there's something out there I haven't thought of that would require a refinement of the principle. But I don't think there's something out there that I haven't thought of that would require a refinement of the principle in a way that would undermine the argument I'm using it to make.
Okay.
So I think, close enough for the purposes of this argument, even if it's not like the Lord's one true truth about the nature of intrinsicality.
Great. Okay, now in jumping to section 3, so you consider basically an argument that Wielenberg gestures at sort of in arguing against Robert Adams' classic book, Finite and Infinite Goods. And then Murphy basically kind of picks up on that argument and then further refines it and elaborates it. But before we get that on the table, can you tell us what does it mean for God to be an Aseity being, and kind of how does that factor into this argument from sovereignty Aseity?
That's a great question. So Aseity is like the most important divine attribute that you never hear much about. And I mean that literally, like you go looking in the philosophical literature for analyses of divine attributes, you'll find dozens of papers, maybe even hundreds of papers on omnipotence. You'll find dozens of papers, maybe hundreds of papers on omniscience. You'll find even more papers on moral goodness or moral perfection, especially if you let stuff from the argument from evil count. There's 6 papers on Aseity, maybe. There's just not a lot out there.
Wow.
Which is interesting because, especially historically, this is one of the classic God attributes. It's one of the things that's sort of part of the motivating conception of God in all the classical theistic religions. And so, What does Aseity mean? Again, we probably don't have a fully defined definition, but here's the thing it's trying to capture. It's trying to capture at least the following 2 thoughts about God. Thought number 1, God is self-sufficient for God's important properties. In other words, merely existing is all it takes for God to have God's core attributes. And I'm going to leave core there annoyingly vague, so you could try to fill it in with something like intrinsic or essential, but that won't capture everything. So take an attribute like being the creator. It's important that God be the creator. That's part of the core concept of God. On the other hand, being a creator is both an extrinsic property and, at least according to the tradition, an accidental property of God's. So trying to fill it in with a more technical term, at least none of the plausible candidates works. We'll just say core here. So that's one thought. God doesn't need to depend on anything else to have God's core properties. But number 2, God is at least somehow behind or responsible for everything else. And this sort of gets worked out in doctrines about creation or concurrence and things like that. But Aseity is sort of the root thing that's motivating. Why does God have to create everything? Why does God have to provide concurrence so that everything continues existing? Aseity is the thing at the bottom of that. It's sort of Latin ase from itself.
For that explanation, I didn't realize that it's so underdeveloped in the literature.
Yeah,
wow.
I'll shout out this paper by Sarah Adams and John Robson, but analyzing Aseity is probably the best thing that's been written on it so far.
Okay.
But we could use a bigger conversation.
Okay, that's great, and it reminds me of the fact that Murphy actually highlighted the fact that holiness as an attribute has been way underdeveloped in the literature as well.
Yeah.
So there's a lot for you budding Christian philosophers. There you go. Aseity is wide open, and so is holiness as well.
Yeah, badly under-theorized.
Badly under-theorized. Yeah, so you regiment Murphy's argument. Maybe instead of reading the thing just through all the premises, can you kind of give us the sort of gist of it, and then also what you actually have contention with, which premise, or and if you do want to read the individual premises and conclusion, that's fine too.
Yeah. So the thought behind Murphy's argument, which I sort of gave an official regimentation, because that way I could sort of pinpoint, here's the things he's assuming that I'm going to disagree with, or here's the things he's assuming that I think you can't assume together. But the basic thought behind the argument is something like this. Because God is responsible for our having value at all, and this is in virtue of God being responsible for our being or having anything at all, our value is had partially in virtue of a relation to God, namely this like created by or sustained by, or to kind of like dump into the parlance of contemporary metaphysics, there's a relation of explanation between God and our value. And so if you're thinking of the intrinsic properties as the ones that you don't have because of the relations you stand in, then you'd have to think that our value shouldn't be one of our intrinsic properties, since we have it in virtue of this relation. And then, the way I set up the argument, there's a little background about baking the requirement that God be responsible for everything into the assumptions. But that's kind of the thought. Because God's responsible for all our value, it's not ours intrinsically, and so it's not intrinsic value.
Okay, that's a great explanation.
Idea.
So this kind of gets back. This highlights the importance of your chisming to the third principle, independence principle, because as you say, you're not relying on a relational understanding of intrinsicality and extrinsicality. And Murphy bakes that in by saying, look, if we get our goodness from this ase being, or we're somehow sustained, is that what the relation is?
Yeah.
We're sustained in being, then obviously that's a relation, or at least partially. Right. We have that as a result of the relation to God. We derive our value from that relation, but then there's a problem with having a relational understanding of intrinsicality and extrinsicality, as you pointed out, and so that won't work. Is it,
in fact,
kind of rough?
In like the earliest versions of this paper, that whole lengthy discussion of intrinsicality was part of the discussion of this argument. The what's now section 2 just didn't exist. And then I interacted a bit with Mark Murphy on it. He gave comments on it at an online conference, and then we talked back and forth a bit about it in some other venues. And one thing that became clear sort of in the conversation is there's this sort of disagreement between the two of us that it's probably worth bringing up here about the term intrinsic value, where I sort of think of it as this concatenation of intrinsic and value. So for something to be intrinsic, so something to have intrinsic value is for it to have value and to have it intrinsically. Whereas Murphy is thinking of it as kind of a technical term that does a job that you could sort of find if you kind of went through the literature between Course Guide's paper and now, but something that functions as a unit. So you can't break intrinsic value for him down into intrinsic and value. And so as that came out, he sort of encouraged me to take the discussion of intrinsicality and use it as a, like, here's me conceptually engineering the idea of intrinsic value that I'm going to use to claim the creatures have intrinsic value, as opposed to, like, leaving that part of the disagreement unstated, which was the genesis of, like, the direct construction part of the paper.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's helpful. So is this disagreement still dividing you? I mean, I'm assuming you're not. Okay, still dividing you, but I'm assuming it's not such a divide that you're talking past each other. You're
correct. It was helpful to identify that this was one of the points of divergence, because then, like, this is why I did the thing going back into more and trying to draw the, like, not in the way that an actual historian of philosophy would, but in a sort of attempt to draw the genealogy of Intrinsic back into Moore and explain that there
Mm-hmm.
really is this through line from Moore to Korsgaard to the contemporary literature, and that Moore himself, in thinking of intrinsic value, is thinking of it like I do, as just this concatenation between intrinsic and value.
Mm-hmm.
That's what, hence the lengthy quotations from Principia Ethica in that part of the paper.
Okay, gotcha. And then, so after you deal with this version of Murphy's argument, you go into another version that Murphy argues essentially concludes that creatures have no intrinsic value. And you note that it relies on basically the absolute goodness of God. Now, Murphy, at least in his work on holiness, absolute really has an important uh, terminology or technical role. So, is absolute goodness of God in this argument that Murphy makes, is that having a really regimented definition or role, like as opposed to just the goodness of God, the absolute goodness of God? Is that important?
So this is something I think that also evolves out of the conversations that came out of God's Son Ethics. So if you go read the paragraphs in God's Son Ethics where he makes this argument, that God thus every possibility for goodness doesn't get a further gloss, which is why I was able to step in and be like, oh, let's try to figure out what this means. Here's a version, here's a version, here's a version. And then, like, my response to the argument is basically like, well, this interpretation won't work, and that interpretation won't work, and that interpretation won't work. So it looks like we can't find a good way to interpret the argument. So that's just one of the, I think Murphy has kind of gotten drilled deeper into what he thinks that's going to mean and entail. That's why I don't know if that's the whole question why, because I haven't talked to him about the holiness book in particular. But I suspect one of the reasons that he's said more now is that you've got people like me going like, hey, say more about that.
Okay. So you mentioned that he relies on this notion of absolute goodness of God and the additive internal logic of intrinsic value. So let me just kind of do my best to sketch the argument, and then you're welcome to adjust it or fill it in. So the basic idea, as you mentioned, is that God exhausts all possibilities for goodness. Perhaps you can say why he thinks that in a minute. So when God creates creatures, he's not adding to the overall goodness in the world. If creatures were intrinsically good, then adding to them to the universe would increase the total amount of goodness in that world, because a collection of two intrinsically things, if we're just thinking of additively, is better than a collection with just one intrinsically good thing. Thus, so created beings are not intrinsically good because they're not adding to the overall goodness in the world that God creates, because God already exhausts all the possibilities of goodness in that world. Is that a good sort of rough sketch of his argument?
Yeah. There's this sort of baseline split amongst theists who think about value on what to say about God's value and the surpassability of God's value. So there's one camp that wants to say the value of God is absolutely unsurpassable, even by collections that have more than God in them. Mark Johnston gives an argument like this. Alex Bruce gives an argument like this. And it is a very traditional way of thinking. So this this thought has got a pretty good pedigree. But a consequence of that is that either, this is the way Murphy went, so the other stuff isn't intrinsically valuable, because you sort of stick to your guns on saying, look, the logic of intrinsic value is that adding intrinsically good things into a collection gets you a better collection, at least considered as a collection, i.e. setting aside issues about organic unity or other sorts of interaction. I'd say that, like, kind of coming out of the game theoretic, decision theoretic tradition, which is where I am, and taking something like a dominance principle as bedrock rationality, is going to want to say, look, add intrinsically good things to God, collections with God, you get slightly better collections. So I did this in one paper just trying to make the point that, like, if you have God plus an apple, that's better than God alone. Why? Because you get God either way, and then the other one you get the apple. And this is like skeleton kind of ways to spell out both of these views, the unsurpassability type view versus the always increasing view. So the question is just sort of this intuitive loggerhead. It's not like one side or the other is going to commit a technical mistake. Now, unsurpassability is a bit different than what Murphy said in the book, which was that God exhausts all possibilities for goodness. That's even stronger than unsurpassability. So someone like Mark Johnston is going to allow for creatures to be intrinsically valuable. The value they bring to the world is extra value without being added value in his terminology. I think I'm a little more sympathetic to that version of the view than to the one where I think you should give up the additive character of intrinsic value before you give up the intrinsic value of the creatures.
I see. Right. Get rid of sort of the methodological principle of additivity. Keep the intrinsicality. So let me, just so make sure I'm tracking.
Yeah.
There's two ways of thinking about whether God sort of, his goodness is unsurpassable or is surpassable.
Right. So let me run through a tree here. So here's choice point 1. The value of God is surpassable or it's insurpassable. So if you say it's surpassable, that's the side. That's where I go. And then you've got to say some more to make that not offensive to pious ears. Use the phrase. But set that aside for now.
To pious ears. Close your ears if you're pious and you're watching this.
So that's one choice point.
Because on the face of it, it does sound problematic. Like, how could God's goodness be surpassable?
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
And the short answer there is like by God plus God and other stuff. So I don't think you could get like a godless collection that surpasses God's value, but like God and more, sure, let's take the more. Just a quick add for my own views. Now go on the other side of the tree, the unsurpassable. So you say God's value is unsurpassable. Right. You then have another choice point because here's an inconsistency. God's value is unsurpassable. There are non-God things with intrinsic value. Two things with intrinsic value gets you more intrinsic value than either of them alone. So one of those three has got to go. If you say the intrinsic value of other stuff has got to go, you might be Mark Murphy. If you say the additivity of intrinsic value has got to go, you might be Mark Johnston.
Okay. I'm more with Johnston on that one. Yeah, I think now I don't know if that's important, but how does he get rid of that additivity principle?
By deciding it's the least painful test.
Okay, it's out by being the least painful test. Okay.
He's got a really detailed paper on this in OSPR. I think that's the title. Why did the one not remain within itself? Like, it's a very rich paper, definitely worth reading and thinking through.
Okay, that's a good.
Because there are huge consequences for things like ethics if you accept his view that he then works through and spells out. But the additivity intrinsic value is such a theory-driven thing as it is, given that we're already using kind of like highly theoretical notions like intrinsic value and additivity, that it's not like there's necessarily going to be a massive intuitive cost here, or like something that you need to then say something about how value aggregation works, or you have to say that you think that there's no systematic thing to say about how value aggregation works. But it's not like he's doing the I don't believe in tables thing, where there you do have to do a lot of work to make that go down.
Okay. And I had an idea that I'll just run by you. What about the idea that there's a conservation of goodness, kind of like the law of conservation, like the goodness of God forms something like a closed system? So like the total goodness in the universe is constant over time, can't be created or destroyed, yet the goodness can be sort of spread around differently through different receptacles of that value. So if God didn't create, there'd still be the same total amount of goodness, but it wouldn't be sort of spread out in a diversity of ways. And then when you add intrinsically good things like us to the world, it doesn't increase the total amount of goodness, but it does increase other values in the universe, like intrinsically good things forming a collection can be a diversity of things, and perhaps diversity is a value. I don't know if that cuts ice or if that's another way of thinking it, but where does that put me in the branch? And is that a good way of thinking of things? Or
So one thing to note here is that a lot of times in this literature, goodness and value get used interchangeably. So it's not like goodness is itself a quantity where you could get your goodnessmometer and go ping things and see how much goodness they have. Goodness is just like this kind term for the actual value instantiated, the things that generate the value, which might be relationships, which might be something like dignity, which might be something like beauty. Goodness is just sort of a way to talk about that sort of thing, generically speaking. So then something like diversity wouldn't be an alternative to goodness. It would be a kind of goodness.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
So you couldn't have there's nothing incoherent about the view you just gave about there being. Basically, you're saying goodness has this field-like behavior. It can concentrate or it can spread out.
Right.
But the sum of values is always the same. Like there's nothing incoherent about that. That could potentially even. To say that that's how you explain the goodness of non-God things, you'd have to go a little further, because then you'd need a view maybe where God is a part of everything. That gets kind of like the trope bundle theory view of L.A. Paul's that I brought in the discussion of that.
Okay.
And there are some people who aren't going to like that because they're not going to like God being, or even a part of God being a part of other things. So traditionalists are not going to go for anything like that. But like I said, the view is coherent. It would be one to put on the table and do the cost-benefit analysis for.
Okay. There's further work for either myself or for you.
Exactly.
So picking up on that Paul-style mereological bundle theory, can you explain that part of the paper? I got a little fuzzy. So are you saying that God gets the additional goodness when we bundle things up? Or I'm not sure I was tricked. Can you kind of explain why you bring in this bundle theory? It's to bundle God with other things and show how they can have more value. Is that right?
Yeah. So here's one thought. Say we're trying to interpret the phrase, God exhausts the possibilities for goodness. Well, one specification of that is every instinct of the property goodness is a property of God's. At which point you then need to ask, okay, well, how can that happen? So you need a theory where it makes sense to talk about different instances of a property, and you need a theory where it makes sense about multiple things being able to possess the same instance of a property. So already you need some somewhat rarefied metaphysics to do that. However, it is doable, and the Paul-style bundle theory is at least the easiest way that I could think of to do that. So Paul's actually motivating her theory thinking about the puzzles of material constitution, and I'll just run through that real quickly here. So you've got a lump of clay, sort of traditionally named lumple because I think it was supposed to be lump 1 in the original manuscript, but somebody made a typo. So now the lump of clay is always named lumple, and it's formed into this statue. The statue is named Goliath, and then there's this question. So you've got this object; it's a statue, but it's made from a lump of clay, and you could squish it and still have a lump of clay, but not the statue. And so then there's puzzle how many things are there. And if you say just one thing, then you've got to explain what it is that got destroyed in the squish. And if you say, and among other issues, and if you say 2 things, you've got to explain why the statue and the lump of clay that constitute it, how to end up not double counting their mass so that you've got don't end up with a 4 kilogram thing out of 2 kilograms of clay. So Paul's suggestion here is to go with the dualist solution. You've got a statue and a lump, but they've got all these properties in common. Their mass property, and if you've got tropes, which are sort of abstract particulars, think of it as an instance of a property individualized. So the color of a shirt would be a redness trope. the color of a different red shirt would be a distinct redness trope, and then you have to say something about why they're both redness tropes, but that trope theorists have got that covered. So this allows things to share properties, because if the same trope is part of multiple things, and you think of a thing here as just like a bundle of tropes, you have like a primitive bundling relation, or in Paul's case, what you have is a composition relation that obeys a formal mereology. That's how you build your object. So the world, once the world's fundamentally a bunch of tropes floating around, how do you get things out of the tropes? By composition with them. Then it's coherent to say that you've got two things that have these parts in common, these tropes. And so, applying that back to our original problem, how is it that God can exhaust the possibilities of goodness by having every goodness property as a property of God's? Well, anytime a goodness trope shows up, God put a reach out and be like, yeah, mine too. So originally, there's just like whatever goodness feature God had pre-creation, and read pre there metaphorically so we don't run afoul of timelessness stuff. Then God decides to create, so God creates Adam and Eve, and Adam and Eve have also got some goodness tropes. But because there's this feature of God where God has to exhaust possibilities for goodness, those particular parts of Adam and Eve, their goodness tropes, also accrue to God. And then the point I make in the paper is that while this is a way of instantiating the praise, it's not a way of maintaining the unsurpassability of divine goodness, because the natural thing to say there is, especially if you're sort of keeping the additivity of intrinsic value principle, is that God got a little bit better when he created stuff. It just sort of absorbed their value every time he creates intrinsically good things. Now, again, there's a lot of people that are going to hate this picture, so my point isn't that I think this is plausible. My point is just that when you start working out the metaphysics of one way of specifying that premise, this is what you end up with.
So you're trying to show that these entailments of that, or how you could make sense of it using a trope, L.A. Paul style trope bundle theory, results in you not getting unsurpassability.
Exactly. So it's a way for the argument to fail.
It's a way for the argument to fail.
Right. Because the goal here was to find a way to interpret that phrase, God exhausts all possibilities for goodness, in such a way that makes the argument a good argument, or a successful argument. And so each interpretation, I have to either show it's a bad interpretation, or that even if it's a good interpretation, it would undermine the argument in some other way.
Okay, there is the possibility of filling it out another way, right?
Of course,
but you're saying this is, at least to my lights, this is the best way, using this Paul style trope bundle theory. This is the best way of making sense of how God exhausts all possibilities of goodness. He takes anything that's good as a trope, he includes it in his bundle.
Exactly. This is like the argument of this section is a sort of argument by challenge. I don't understand this God exhausts all possibility for goodness phrase, which means I don't know how to assess the argument, but here's all the ways I could think of to understand it, and on none of them does the argument work. Now that doesn't that's not a proof that the argument fails. It's not like I definitively pointed out, I don't know, a flaw in the logic or a false a premise that we can determinately say is false. What it is sort of balls at your court now. Explain how this thing means in a way that is. This is the titchy bit in philosophy where there's this great David Lewis footnote that's some people will object to me here by saying they don't understand what I mean, but a good philosopher who doesn't understand something will be sure not to understand something by which it could be understood. But here I'm not doing the obnoxious I don't understand. I'm doing the genuinely don't understand here. It's an invitation for partisans of this view to come back with a different gloss on the phrase. That A makes the argument good, and B is, I guess, more understandable.
Now, I know this paper's forthcoming, but has Murphy replied to this or given more thought?
He's given comments on it and suggestions on how to improve it. I don't think he's written at least I haven't seen a draft of a full-blown response.
Okay. So maybe that'll come out once your paper comes out in the collected volume.
Could be. That'd be a lot of fun. On the other hand, he's a busy guy. Doesn't have to respond to everyone, so.
I know. He is a busy guy. Okay, the reference objection. So in the paper, that kind of wraps up section 4. We're going to kind of skip over section 5, but I recommend you read the paper because he goes through a third way Murphy might sort of the third possible argument from Murphy, and then sort of shows there's problems with that. But I thought we'd get to the reference objection because that's sort of the final section of the paper. And you sort of bring in philosophy of language considerations. Can you give us a sort of a sketch of the reference objection and then kind of where you think this leaves us regarding the dialectic sort of going forward?
Yeah, so here's a style of objection in philosophy. Somebody tries to say something, and you look at the thing that they tried to say and go, that's not actually sayable. And this is kind of like bad for what they were attempting to do. And so the classic example of this is in debates about absolute generality, where the debate is over whether you can quantify over absolutely everything. And some people say, no, you can't. And then Tim Williamson comes along and is like, you can't say that. Like, literally, you can't say that. But this is his paper, Everything. So I'm kind of trying to do that style of objection to Murphy here. So take this sentence. God has intrinsic value and creatures don't. Like, that's an encapsulation of his thesis. So then I want to say, that's actually a really weird thing to try to say if you think about the kind of families of views of how religious language works that we have out there. And so I go through these 3 approaches, broadly speaking. There's univocity. Predicates apply to God and creatures in exactly the same way. There's equivocity, that's like the other end. The predicates that apply to God and creatures are completely different. All they have in common is the name, is one way of putting it. And then there are sort of mixed views, like the Thomistic doctrine of analogy is going to be one of those mixed views. And in the prelims of the book of God's Own Ethics, Murphy endorses something like analogy. So he's kind of already on the record as preferring one of the mixed camp views. So then I say, all right, if predicates apply to God univocally, then there's no issue saying that creatures have, or God has intrinsic value, but creatures don't. On the other hand, if you try to say it in one of these sort of mixed views where there's like an analogy between the predicates, but they either express different properties or different ways of having properties, that phrase comes out really funny because it's not like intrinsic value is a creature of religion. We learn about intrinsic value thinking about things like ourselves or gold or like other stuff that seems to have value just because of what it is. So the term intrinsic value gets its reference through this sort of ordinary use, in which case it would be really surprising if it didn't refer to a property of ordinary things. It would be even more surprising if it referred to a divine property that we kind of only have access to via deep religious contemplation and or revelation, or maybe don't have access to at all. So if any of the kind of transcendent approaches to religious language, the analogy or the equivocity or any of those is right, like we shouldn't be able to talk about divine properties except with terms that come out of religious traditions, because ordinary everyday terms, they found their reference in everyday uses, and they're going to refer to properties of creatures. So turns out you need like a very specific view of how language works in religious contexts in order to plausibly even be able to say and mean what you're trying to mean, that God has intrinsic value and creatures don't. Now, how much weight would I put on this objection? Probably not as much as on the rest of the paper, but I thought it was an interesting puzzle to float.
Yeah, that's great. And religious language is an important thing to contemplate as well. How are we referring to various objects?
Right. Another topic for the important but badly under theorized basket.
That's true. So yeah, thank you. Your paper has opened up a ton of lines of inquiry. Do you have any plans to further refine this, or are you sort of waiting for your interlocutors to kind of get back to you? It seems like you leave it in their court in many different instances.
Yeah, yeah. That's kind of my goal, was just to push the ball back out towards other folks and see what they came up with. I don't know as I necessarily need to do a follow up, although I'm sure these things will come up again in future work, and at that point, I may need to develop things further. But I don't
And also,
anticipate like a direct sequel to this paper unless it's a response to a response.
gotcha. Okay. And throughout this conversation, you've mentioned a ton of important methodological points too, which is really helpful. Kind of on that point, I don't know if you saw it or not, but the Daily News talked about like how students struggle to read anything over 10 pages long. I don't think this is news, but there was like I don't know, it's supposedly getting worse. Like students are having more trouble reading, especially difficult philosophical things. They've always had trouble. I did, especially when I first started out. But do you have any advice you'd give for people reading like philosophy of religion, analytic theology, they're just doing it on their own? A lot of people who follow this channel are sort of, just enthusiasts of Christian philosophy and theology. Is there anything you do that helps with your comprehension or perseverance in reading some of these difficult texts?
So the first thing I would say is, especially when you're introducing yourself to a new work, don't try to just read everything in order.
That's
You
excellent.
should.
Yeah.
So say you're interested in a new paper. First thing you should read is the abstract, then the introduction, then the conclusion. After you've read those things, you can then go read the middle of the paper if you're kind of A, still interested in the paper, and B, so you're now sort of oriented to the point where you think you can start to follow what's going on and not lose track of the bigger picture, which is one reason why you would give up after 10 pages, is you just sort of got too far into the weeds and lost track of the dialectic. And especially in professional writing that's sort of written because we need to explore the weeds, you get a lot of that.
Yeah.
The other thing to do is to sort of, just like you don't try to bench 300 pounds on your first go, like don't necessarily try to take on a field review paper to start with. There's a whole jargon, there's a whole kind of philosophical literacy that if you don't have it, these papers become impenetrable. And once you do have it, they become much more manageable. So sort of use good introductory resources, use books and things that people have written for more popular audiences to sort of build your conceptual repertoire, especially if this is something that you're sort of thinking, I'm doing this as like a semi-hobby type thing. Don't be surprised that you can't jump into the deep end and immediately swim. Wade into the shallows, get your feet wet, start beginning to learn how these various terms work, find authors who are better at expressing them and who are better at communicating new terminology to people, because that's a special skill that some philosophers have, some philosophers only kind of have, and some philosophers definitely don't have.
That's excellent. And you have that rare philosopher like Swinburne who can go take you to the deep end, the shallow end. He can take you to the pond. He can take you to the lake. He can take you to the ocean.
Yep.
So yeah, no, that's really helpful. Excellent advice. And I thought we'd end with a new segment. Now, you didn't know I was going to do this. I didn't know I was going to do this. I just decided to bring out the book of questions. Just kind of a fun little ending. So
Okay.
I'm going to look up a couple questions, and some of the questions are actually inappropriate, so I'll skip those. But okay, here we go. Here's one. This is very philosophical. This is the first one I turned to. Do you believe in capital punishment? Would you be willing to pull the switch to execute a man sentenced to death if you were randomly selected by the courts to do so and knew he would go free if you refused? Assume you know nothing about his crime.
I don't believe in capital punishment. I don't think that I think the intrinsic dignity of humans is such that we never have the right to take each other's lives as a kind of punishment. We might sometimes have the right to take each other's lives as like self-defense or harm prevention, but I think those are going to be the only contexts in which killing another human is appropriate. In a case of like capital punishment where you already have complete control over the other person, I think killing them is always going to be extra. Now, the second hypothetical is interesting because of the consequence. So, like, if I am in a society where capital punishment is a thing, and me refusing just means somebody else is going to do it, then, like, there's no reason for me to involve myself in this thing. But in the ranking of outcomes, it might end up being that even though it's sort of, depending on how you want to put it, wrong or prima facie wrong to kill another person in those circumstances, it might be even more wrong to let them go. Like, say they're a serial murderer, and if they get let go, they're going to go serial murder a bunch of people. Then
Right.
killing them might be the lesser of two evils because it's a kind of harm prevention, and then it would be morally appropriate.
Okay. Yeah, and this would be assuming that you're the only person who could do it for some
Exactly.
bizarre reason.
So I wouldn't kill the person as punishment, but I would kill them via like the state instituted means of punishing as harm prevention if that turns out to be necessary.
Okay. Okay, interesting. Wow. Okay, that was I'm going to keep the old book of questions segment there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a good
now,
one.
where do we send people to follow you and learn more about your work? Where do you recommend?
My Dull People's profile is probably the easiest way to get my stuff as it emerges. I keep that the most up to date. Anybody who goes to my website is going to see stuff that was current as of like 2022. But my Dull People's stuff, is like the ritual at this point. You get your paper accepted, you get your proofs, you submit your proofs, they take your proofs, and then you go put something on Phil pages on Phil papers that way, and then you share that via your social media. So that's the way to get my stuff to have fastest. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you so much. This is a really interesting paper. I'll provide a link to it because you do have a preprint publication available, so people can actually read it. There's stuff in there that we definitely didn't discuss, and it's worth kind of mulling and chewing on. So definitely go check it out. Thank you so much, Dr. Rubio, for being on the Coffee with Philosophers podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun, and thanks for discussing my work.